Welcome back to your ongoing pursuit of your Bachelor's of Multifamily Science here at the Apartment Academy, the multifamily industry's only operations-focused podcast. I'm your host, the Dean of the Apartment Academy, Daniel Cunningham, and today it's just us. It's office hours here at the Apartment Academy. We're going to have a little one-on-one talking about what happened in 2022 and some of the trends that we can see already for 2023, because it's been an interesting year and it's going to be an interesting year. So just us today. Let's get into it. Well, let's start off by talking about the lawsuit that was filed against RealPage and a number of their clients this year. The lawsuit is alleging price fixing and collusion between operators as facilitated through what many people still call YieldStar, but is now actually, I think it's called RealPage Revenue Management. And if you haven't used this software, then I'll explain a little bit how that works. But if you have used the software, you know that all that's happening here is the same kind of revenue management system that is used by airlines, hotels, rental car companies, cruise lines. You are trying to set the most competitive pricing possible based on what the market can bear. In the past, what this has looked like is you go down, you send your community manager or your leasing agent, and they go and they canvass the area, and they visit other properties. Maybe sometimes they pretend like, they're leasing. Sometimes you get a friendly relationship, you pick up the phone and call, but you're trying to ascertain what are other people charging. The guy down the street's charging $1,500 for a one bedroom. You look at that and you think, well, my pool's a little nicer, so we're going to charge $1,600. But there's always been this marketplace that is based on charging whatever rent you think you can garner based on what everybody else seems to be garnering, and what you're garnering, of course, at your own community. But in the past, we've just been limited to that data set, some subjective assessment by somebody working at the property as to how you compare to the guy down the street, and therefore what you can charge. That nothing has changed about the way rents are set in that respect. What YieldStar allows you to do, and LRO and some of the others, that revenue management systems that are out there, what they allow you to do is to take in other factors that affect your net revenue, your effective rent, that frankly is too time-consuming, difficult, complicated for mere mortals to figure out on their own. So they take into account things like, what is your average time to turn a unit? Okay, because that's a loss. If you're going to raise rents on somebody, you have to make sure that the amount that you think you can raise rents is going to offset the amount of time that the unit is offline while you turn it, and then what your average time to lease a ready unit is, because the combination of the time to turn a unit and the time it takes to lease it, that's a period where you're losing rent. And that's not really ever figured into the equation in a meaningful way before revenue management software came along and said, okay, this is what your average loss is going to be if you raise rents and this person moves out. It looks into average cost. It takes into account things like the average cost to turn a unit, and other factors that, again, never really factored into good decision making before. And now it can take all of that into account and allow multifamily operators to make a better, more informed decision about what the right price is to charge for their unit. That's all. There is no tacit agreement to artificially inflate rent between operators. That's just silly. You cannot solve a supply and demand problem in housing affordability by restricting investors' ability to earn the highest returns possible. You'll actually drive more developers out of this industry. One of the things, because I've been on the developer side, one of the things that drives developers and investors in this industry is this notion that there's this diamond in the rough. There's this gem that's hidden by old appliances or a poorly maintained facade. That if you just inject the right amount of rehab or better management, coat of paint, better marketing, new signage, you inject these things into this property, that you can create a better community, a more appealing community, and that you can raise rents. Okay, if you start putting in blockages to people being able to sort of maximize rents, you are going to dissuade people who invest in apartments, who build apartments, who create housing. You're going to dissuade them from getting in the industry, because if they can't maximize their rent, or if they can't imagine that they can maximize their rent, because you don't always get it right, then fewer people are going to get into the business, and fewer housing units are going to be created, etc. It's really targeting landlords unnecessarily, because I guess everyone, you have the option if you want to take a cruise, you have the option if you want to stay at a hotel, you have to live someplace. And maybe it feels worse that that cost of living for you is being somewhat set by a piece of software, or somewhat set by what the guys down the road are charging, and maybe you don't feel that's right. But that's the free market. And the free market is what allows for the creation of new housing. Rent control, another bad idea that sounds great, but ultimately, time after time, proven it's not without a shadow of a doubt that rent control increases housing shortages, because it dissuades people from getting into the industry, because you can't charge the maximum rent for your unit. And when people don't want to build housing, or people don't want to rehab crappy old, Class C housing, then you end up with a shortage of places to live. And when rent control is in place, people never want to move out, which exacerbates the problem. So I would think that this lawsuit ultimately will not go anywhere. Unfortunately, great operators like Greystar and FPI are going to be dragged through the mud in the interim. They don't deserve this. They are not colluding. And they'll have to spend a ton of money defending themselves, unfortunately, in the meantime. My best guess is that if anything comes out of this that will negatively affect the industry on a long-term basis, it will be that revenue management software may disconnect a little bit some of the inputs that they have with respect to what they know about what the guy down the street is charging. We may go back to that input being, you got to figure that out. You got to go drive the comps, the competitive set. You got to make the phone calls down the street to see what they're charging. RealPage may no longer be able to utilize the data it has to help suggest what those rates should be. But revenue management should and will, in my opinion, continue to play a central role in helping investors maximize their return on investment. The another thing that was very interesting about 2022 was really the rise of virtual leasing. One of the things that came out of the pandemic is that we've dispelled this notion that people are really necessary. A in-person interaction is necessary in order to lease an apartment unit. I remember I said it myself when I was running apartment buildings, because I heard it a million times from my mentors when I was early in the business, and that is that when people lease a unit at a community, they're leasing you. They're leasing you, the leasing agent. They're creating a relationship with you, and it's based on you and that relationship you create, less than it is based on the community itself. That is not true. Turns out that was not true. And the pandemic proved it, because we saw, we were forced into a mode where we didn't have people on site, and yet people needed to find housing. So how could we accommodate them? Well, that was the rise of virtual leasing. There are a number of flavors of how this happened. There were just complete self-guided tours where you have a lock that can be remotely operated and a key assigned to that, so people can get in and open a unit and take the tour on their own. You have great providers of video tours that came along. So maybe you can't get to the site, but you can see a very highly engaging video that shows you everything you need on the interior of the unit. You had Skype, Zoom facilitated pseudo live interactions where you could have somebody who was with you as you were taking the tour. And all of these methodologies, which worked with varying degrees of success, at the end of the day, all proved that certainly for Class B and C properties where people are more price centric, you can do virtual leasing very successfully, achieve good occupancies, achieve market rents without somebody having to stand there at the property and walk the prospects through the tour. Some evidence that Class A properties with above market rents and above market amenities, and where you're really trying to sell an experience, some evidence that a live person really helps still sell in that market, but not in every case. But it may not be a complete cure-all for in all situations, but I would say certainly for most. I think a fourth type of virtual leasing is on the horizon, and that is using augmented reality. So where you have a HoloLens, a Magic Leap type of headset, where you can go into a unit with this headset on, and you can virtually place your furniture. You can summon a leasing agent who can show up in front of you right there and ask them questions, and then they can be dismissed and go off when you're finished. You can read and sign leases, right in front of you, right there on your own schedule. I think that's coming. It's a little more setup, a little more time. The tech is still kind of early. Magic Leap has been stumbling out of the gate a little bit, but I think that's on the way. And so, you are going to be in 2023. You're going to be leasing more and more properties without having a leasing agent there at the property on the front lines, and I think you are ushering in a day where you're going to have a completely touchless property from the moment that you arrive to look and see if you want to live there to the day that you move out. And some of that's going to be facilitated by centralization, which I want to talk about a little bit. So centralization really has been, I think, a central point of discussion at nearly every event that I've been to in the latter half of 2022. What happened is during the pandemic and subsequently with the Great Resignation, we've been left with a dearth of maintenance and operations staff coming into our industry. A lot of them have been leaving the industry, frankly, because people can make better money in some cases, more easily, probably in all cases, from home. There's a lot of work from home options now. It didn't exist, 2 or 3 years ago. And this has always been an industry that's been difficult and hard on people for reasons we've talked about here at the Apartment Academy on a number of occasions. It is you deal with a lot of emotional issues. You deal with a lot of abuse. The Karen effect is often nowhere more prevalent than in apartment buildings when somebody's not happy, and they take it out on the people that are there. And budgets for operating communities, for operating apartments, don't often include luxurious salaries for those that are staffing the property. It's just one of the things that we've struggled with, and in part for good reason. I mean, the communities have to be able to cash flow in order for investors to be interested in creating housing, and sometimes that's done on the backs of of salaries that are lower than what people could get in other markets, and now they're finding out. So, we're having a shortage of people to staff our maintenance and our community manager and our leasing agent positions, and we are having a discussion. How can we do more with less? And that has really accelerated, I think, what's been in the back of a lot of operators' minds, for all, at least larger operators, which is this idea of centralization. We have already, in many cases, although not all, centralized accounting. Used to be, there was a day when I first got into business, everybody was doing their own bills on at the property level. They were approving POs, cutting checks sometimes. That has gradually migrated to centralized services where that's all being handled at corporate office. If you haven't done that, if you're still at a community where that's happening, somebody's got to wake up there, because that's really not the most efficient way to handle payables. But so we saw the early instance of that. Then we saw by really 2016, 2017, when the first companies that were doing centralized tour scheduling, the kind of the anyone home sort of companies that were offloading and centralizing the role of receiving phone calls for lease inquiries, setting tours, providing information about the properties, that sort of thing. That was kind of the first shot over the bow. Now we are looking at, we just talked about virtual leasing. We just talked about how virtual leasing now might, again, allow us to do more with less on the leasing side. Now the focus is on maintenance and how we can do more with less on maintenance. And generally, the directionally, it seems that what we're talking about is some version of creating pods where you would have a central, core, a cohort of service managers, perhaps with some level of specialization, like one's the plumbing guy, the other guy's the HVAC guy, and those service technicians are then dispatched throughout a portfolio on an as-needed basis, rather than being stationed at a property permanently. The other flavor of this is, to some extent, you are outsourcing your maintenance to local providers who are probably more expensive, definitely more expensive, but if they're provided on an on-demand scenario, they can be within what you would normally budget for those. They can handle maintenance within what your normal budget maintenance costs would expect to be, and so you don't have this. You don't have people on site. You don't have people on staff. You trade off some amount of control and maybe even some brand control, and you hand that off to a third-party vendor. But that's been done successfully, and probably that will increase as well. What I don't think, which is this third version that's being batted about, and which I disagree with, which is I don't think that pushing maintenance to the residents is going to take hold. I don't think it's a good idea. It would probably be limited to basic things anyway, such as changing smoke detector batteries or unclogging toilets. And I frankly think consumers expect those things to be part of the value they get through renting. It is part of the joy of living in an apartment building, is not having to worry about any of the maintenance. And now you want to make residents unclog their own toilets. I don't think they want to do that. I don't even think it's a good idea to have the residents changing the batteries in their smoke detectors. What if they don't? What if they're fine living with the chirping smoke detector, or they pull the battery out and the whole thing's dead, and then you have a fire? Then whose fault is it? If there's an injury, or worse yet, a fatality, and you've pushed off the maintenance to the person living in that unit who didn't do it, and you didn't check to see if they did it. I just think it's fraught with a lot of issues. I know there is some models for this overseas. The customer service expectations overseas are just different than the institutional, professional, managed properties you have in the United States, in my opinion. I just think that's a bad idea. But we'll see. And in any case, you're going to see fewer maintenance people employed by individual properties in favor of this kind of shared services model. By the way, this all plays right into the hands of the consolidation trend that has been taking place. In order to pull some of this off, you have to have scale. In order to have a pod of maintenance people, you need enough properties in that area that you can keep people full-time engaged by sending them around to different communities. And that happens best with large property management companies that have, at least 10,000 units, somewhere in that range. It happens really well when you've got 20, 30,000 units where you can have regional centers of excellence and this sort of thing. And so I think that this is the early death knell for your SMB boutique property managers, which some owners prefer because they feel like, and in many cases they do get a level of attention and specialization that is different than what you get in a large national property management company. But as an industry where margins were already razor thin, starts to compress those margins further by moving out of the budget a number of staff people thanks to centralization, smaller operators are going to get squeezed out of there. I just think that's inevitable. But also things will get better on some fronts that will really help this. That will really help shuttle in this era of centralization, and that is AI is getting better by leaps and bounds. We already have chatbots and we have call centers. Many people are unhappy with call centers because oftentimes you're being handed off to, a call center that's overseas. The prospect can tell it's overseas. The person overseas is not trained very well. There's a lot of turnover over there, and that's not been always the greatest experience. But AI and automation are getting much better fast. So very, very soon, you're going to have chatbots that are indistinguishable from a human being. I absolutely believe that. That they will pass the Turing test 99.9% of the time. If you're not playing around with ChatGPT, which just last week, I think, OpenAI unveiled this latest version, you should try it just so you can understand how well we're going to be able to answer leasing questions and frankly, maybe management questions or maintenance questions, who knows? But certainly in the short term, answering leasing questions via AI very soon, effectively, thoroughly, in a way that feels like you have a human on the other end of the line, in text for sure, and then very soon with artificially generated voices. That's very exciting. It might be frightening to some people in that we are talking about a net reduction in the in employment in the multifamily industry, for sure. I do think and believe it to be a good idea that some of these dollars that are saved should go more to like resident facing services, better concierge type offerings, for example. But we are looking at a net decrease in the staff per unit math that we've all been used to. It was 50, one person per 50 in the day. I was just talking to an operator out of Iowa who I love. I'll say her name, Tina Smothers, who was talking about they're about a 1 per 100. They think they're much more efficient in that respect. That's going to go to 1 per 200 or none at all, and have a completely touchless apartment living experience I was talking about earlier. I think that's right around the corner. And if you're going to have less oversight, I'll just take this opportunity to talk about Leonardo real quick here. You're going to need better technology to track the critical maintenance and operations activities that still need to be completed on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And this is why I think shameless plug, Leonardo 24/7 is going to grow and continue to grow rapidly as the industry standard for operations and maintenance software that is automating and tracking all of the critical inspections, preventative maintenance, workflows, incident reports, that sort of thing that need to take place still, even as we start to move people off of the property. These things still need to happen, and many of them need to happen on site. And you need some way to monitor that that's going on, and give owners and operators real-time visibility that that's happening, and not just cross their fingers that all that stuff is going on as scheduled. So this centralization theme for Leo, I think, is probably is going to make Leo even more important than it is already. We'll be there to serve and improve the technology to accommodate centralization as it progresses. Our last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the market in general, and what I think we can expect in 2023. Although if there has ever been a hazy crystal ball, this is the haziest. We're talking a high level of opacity here. But there's a few things that we can say. First of all, this being December 2022, apartment demand has suddenly and unexpectedly evaporated in much of the country due to what appears to be a freeze in new household formation. That might be because people are anticipating a recession and choosing not to go out and rent an apartment right now, moving in with roommates, hunkering down. It doesn't appear like it's being driven by unemployment, because we're not seeing that yet. But the fact remains, after a blistering 2021 and early 2022, the industry has now recorded, for the first time in 30 years, according to RealPage, that's been tracking this, that apartment demand registered as a negative in Q3. Not just demand reduced, it actually went negative, which is unusual, unheard of in Q3. Typically a very strong quarter, and as a result, when you see a reduction in demand, rental growth has reversed what has been a very strong trend for the past 18 months. I mean, it's been almost amazing, the levels of which some people have been able to raise rents. I get it. We weren't raising rents. We weren't doing anything for 2 years almost during the pandemic. But I don't think anybody expected rents to go up by 25, 30% or more. But that's what's happened. And now that has come down, which, by the way, is normal for October, November timeframes. It's just we didn't see it last year. And so it is either a return to normal from that respect, or it is a harbinger of what's to come and a response to the reduction in the housing demand, in apartment demand that I was just talking about. As long as unemployment rates and job openings continue to defy the threat of recession, then rents actually may continue to grow. Probably, definitely, in my opinion, more slowly than what we saw before, and they may not retract. Remember, we still have a national shortage of housing, somewhere between 3 million and 7 million units, that's not being addressed. In fact, it's getting a little worse because with the rise in interest rates and the cost of materials and the cost of debt, developers have really taken their foot off the gas. So the creation of new housing stock has slowed significantly. Amazingly, apartment cap rates have continued to compress this year, down to, I think, 5.3% is what I just read. That is unusual. That is an indicator of a market that people think rents will keep going to continue to grow. Because if you're buying apartments at a high cap rate or low cap rate, you're expecting high growth in rents. And we have seen some sizzling rent growth. But if you're going to buy communities at a 5.3 cap or less, and I'm sure out here in California or strong markets like Texas, New York, I'm sure the cap rates are probably down still around threes. If you're going to buy an apartment building at that cap rate, you are counting on some sizzling rent growth to be able to justify this pro forma. You are counting on that you're going to be able to raise rents, because if you only operated the property what you bought it at today at that cap rate, you wouldn't make any money. It wouldn't be worth it. You'd be better sticking your money in the stock market. And right now, I think that basing an investment on a pro forma that relies on strong rent growth, even in response to a value add situation where you're going in and you're rehabbing the property, and you're improving the units, I continue to think that with the recession on the horizon, and people still scratching their heads about what's happening with unemployment, I don't think now's a great time to be buying apartment buildings. Nonetheless, sales volume has stayed rather steady, has not dipped that much at the end of this quarter. But you are, I think, in my opinion, taking a big leap of faith if you're going to acquire anything right now. And I would bet that Q1 of next year, if the recession, if interest rates continue to rise, if there's still concerns about that inflation is out of control and that they're going to need to continue to raise rates, which will probably spark a recession, that will probably put the brakes on acquiring apartment buildings, and that will slow down, and then cap rates will start to rise, and then it'll be up to you to figure out where that saddle point is, that magic point where you can start acquiring at a much better cap rate before the industry turns around and they start to come back down again. We'll be watching for that on our end. So there's my best guess at what's happening right now as we enter 2023. This remains a very interesting investment vehicle, multifamily apartments, and as a marketplace, as an industry, I think it's still a very interesting place to work, getting more interesting as AI and as AI improves, and we examine this idea of centralization and finally bringing some level of efficiency into an industry that for a long time was mired in, this is how we've always done it, this is how we do things. I'd like to think that Leonardo's helping to lead that charge. There are other great technology companies as well out there doing other things to facilitate all the things we're talking about. Maybe we'll put a few links to the show notes to companies that you should consider. But as our student population out there, who generally you are on-site folks, operators, regional property managers, I would just say this: think about what's going to be centralized, and move your career path into those areas that are going to be great, that are going to become more important as centralization takes hold. I would not plan to spend a lot of time as a leasing agent right now. There will always be a great demand for maintenance and maintenance supervisors. AI is never going to replace a guy who knows how to turn a wrench. But consider becoming very specialized and getting a skill, like I said, and like I was alluding to earlier, plumbing, HVAC, painting, carpet replacement, because as centralization takes hold, those kinds of skills will be even more in demand, I think, rather than a generalist. So with that, I wish you all happiness, health, and optimism going into 2023. We'll see you here back at the Academy when class resumes sessions in January. Take care.